Morning. Thanks again for joining me as we continue our lesson in Philippians chapter 4. We've been discussing anxiety and stress over the last couple of Sundays. I've heard from a few of you over the last couple of weeks about some of the stress and anxiety that you've been dealing with. Some of it related to the specific pandemic that we've been going through right now, and some of it not. I know that at all times in life we're going to deal with certain types of anxieties that are put on us, and we're going through a time right now which is especially anxious because there are so many unknowns right now. So I think that what we've been going through is really relevant to what's happening right now, and I know that as I've been studying to prepare these lessons, that it's been really beneficial for myself as I deal with a time of uncertainty, and I hope that some of the things that we discuss over the course of these lessons is also helpful for you. So if you haven't done so yet, you can get your Bibles out, turn to Philippians chapter 4, and that's where we're going to begin. As a quick review, we've discussed in this chapter the idea that stress and anxiety is something that everybody deals with. We looked at examples of the Apostle Paul, how he had to deal with anxiety throughout the course of his missionary journeys. God does not promise us that we will be free of stress, that we will be free of anxiety. But we've discussed how our role is not to find opportunities or find ways to avoid anxiety, but we are supposed to build a relationship with Christ so that with courage we can manage the anxieties that we're dealing with, so that we can get through these things, and so that they can be experiences that build us and shape us into the people that God wants us to be. We talked about the idea of rejoicing in the Lord, and how that seems quite counter to what we're doing. Rejoicing in the Lord when you're going through a time of anxiety, but it's the idea that we are remembering God's sovereignty. We're remembering who God is and rejoicing in His sovereignty. We also discussed the idea of letting your gentleness be evident to all. The idea here is to not act out emotionally in a time of stress, and this would be maybe like in the immediate, right? When the stressful or anxious situation happens, what is our immediate reaction to that? And we are reminded in Philippians that we are supposed to be level-headed. We're supposed to be gentle and reasonable as we interact with these stressful events. And then today, we're going to continue looking specifically at chapter 4, verse 6, which has kind of been the focus over the last few lessons. We're going to look at the end of that, and today we're going to talk about how we need to present our requests to God. Presenting our requests to God, and what that looks like. So as we discuss this idea of making requests of God, I think it's important to understand what a request is. And a request is very different than a demand. And a lot of this has to do with the power that's at play, right? We make requests, generally, of those that have more power than us. Those that have more power than us make demands of those that have very little power. And we see this played out in all sorts of areas in our lives. When you are talking to your children, I'm guessing that you likely make demands of your children. Your children likely at times make requests of you, but they certainly don't make demands. A really interesting, I find interesting example of this was during the First World War, when at the end of the war in 1918, the Germans had felt defeated, and they were looking to end the war, and so they made a request of France to have an armistice, and the French general, General Foch, brought his rail car up through the forest up near the German border, and the generals all met in that rail car, and they signed the armistice. And it was very much the French making demands of the Germans in the things that they would have to give up. The Germans made a few requests, but it was very obvious that the power was in the hands of the French. At the end of the meeting, it said that the French general didn't even shake their hands. He simply said, "It's done, get out." And you can see the power at play. When that whole situation was over, it obviously made the Germans quite upset at during the Second World War when the Germans defeated the French in 1940. It was interesting that Hitler made the request that the armistice be signed in the exact rail car that they had signed this armistice in World War I, so that he could basically embarrass the French. And this rail car was still sitting in the forest where it had originally. The armistice for World War I had been signed. It's still there. There was actually a statue of the French general. There were graves and monuments to the dead. And Hitler had the French sign the armistice in this rail car, and now the roles were reversed. The French were making requests of the Germans, and the Germans were making the demands. And as a show of power at the end of this, it's said that Hitler had everything destroyed. The car, the monuments, everything was destroyed except for the statue of the French General Foch that was left standing. It's said so that he could watch and see the German revenge, I guess you could say. So when we talk about the idea of making requests, we see that power is a very, very important part of this. But why is it that when the armistice was signed in both of these wars, how did they decide who got to meet in that rail car to sign it? So there was an obvious recognition by both sides that these were the people that had the power to make decisions. Right? It wasn't the common soldier or civilian who got to be in that rail car to make these decisions. There was a recognition of power on both sides. So how is it that we are able to make requests of God? How are we even granted an audience with God? If I wanted to have an audience with the Prime Minister or the Queen, we know that it is my right to make requests of the Prime Minister, an elected official. Would I get a face-to-face meeting with him to make my requests? Likely not. If I wrote him a letter and made a request, do you think that he would read it and write me back? Probably not. The power dynamic here is even more staggering. The fact that we have the ability to make requests of God is one of I think, the most critical and the greatest show of love that God can give to us. He is so far above us, yet he allows us to make requests of him. And I think that's a really powerful thing to remember as we talk about where we can go in times of stress and in times of anxiety. So I'm going to read Philippians chapter 4, just a couple of verses as a review in what we've been studying. So you can turn there with me. Philippians 4, I'm going to read verses 4 to 6. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. So we're going to focus again primarily on verse 6, and there's three things that stand out in that verse related to us making requests to God or us going to God. The first is this idea of prayer. So it starts with prayer, which is a form of worship. So it begins with worship, a recognition of who God is, the power that he has, and the idea that we need to first worship him. Next, there is the mention of supplication. So this would be an aspect of humility, right? We come before God in worship with a recognition of his power and who he is, so we humble ourselves before him. And then the very last part of verse 6 says that we need to make our requests known to God. Something we're going to talk about in detail a little bit later is that this idea of making our requests known to God, it's really important that when we make these requests that we are specific in our requests. And we'll talk about why that is, but I think that's something I know for myself when I go into prayer. This is something I often forget, and it's really, really important, very powerful in the way that we pray, is making our prayers specific. And we'll talk a little bit later about why that is. As a quick example, you can turn to the book of Matthew chapter 14. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 14 for just a moment. In Matthew chapter 14, starting at verse 22, we get the story of Jesus walking on the water. So a story that probably most of us are familiar with. Jesus has been preaching. He goes up to rest and pray. The disciples go out onto the water, and a storm comes up, and they're very, very afraid. And it's in this moment that Jesus comes out on walking on the water to the boat. So let's read Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 36, and I'll quickly read that story for you. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "Is it a ghost?" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when he got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now, when we look at the character of Peter in the Bible, we get the idea of somebody who is much the opposite of what we've been discussing. We discussed last week that we need to let our gentleness be evident to all, the idea that we need to be level-headed and reasonable. And of all the disciples, Peter probably stands out as one who struggled with a lot of those things. He was hot-headed. He had a bit of a temper. He was quick to make decisions, and sometimes that got him in trouble. So it's interesting here that we see the example of Peter in what it is that we're supposed to be doing. So why is he getting out of the boat? Why is he going out to the Lord in this way? And I've heard it said that perhaps, and it does kind of in many ways look like this, perhaps he is testing God. He's testing Jesus. Right? He sees Jesus on the water. Jesus says that it's him. And so Peter says, "I'm not sure if this is really you. Jesus, if it is you, because I'm not sure, can you ask me to come out onto the water with you? That will prove that it's actually Jesus on the water." And in my mind, when I'm thinking of this passage, I'm thinking that Peter in that moment is probably not thinking that clearly. It seems to me that in that moment when the waves are tossing the boat, the disciples see a real likelihood that they may drown and die. What I see is that Peter looks up at Jesus. He's just been told that it's Jesus. And he sees Jesus and thinks, you know what? It's probably safer right now being with Jesus than it is in this boat. Right? He's out there walking on the water. He looks quite calm. And at this time, they already make this recognition of who he is. And so, in many ways, I think this is a desperate request. "Lord, if it's you, come out. Ask me to come out to you, and then I'll be saved." And I think that when we look at this, we look specifically at Peter's prayer. It's in verse 28. And Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come out onto the water." And I think the important thing here is that when Jesus looks at the request that we make, he looks at our heart. He looks at our intention. It's not about the eloquent words that we use. And I think there's probably people in our lives that we know who make eloquent prayers. And that is an important gift, to make eloquent prayers. It can do a lot to encourage the people that are hearing it. But when Jesus looks at the request that we make, it's not the specific words that we use to make it sound good or make it sound eloquent. He's looking at our heart. And if we think about the prayers of children, they don't use eloquent words, but when children are making requests of God, we see their heart. They're very easy to open up and say whatever it is that's on their mind. And I think in many ways we need to focus on that. We need to focus on the heart. And Jesus recognized that in Peter's request, he was genuine. He was genuinely seeking Jesus in that moment. And something else that we notice about Peter's request is that he was very specific in his request. Jesus, if it's you, ask me or command me to come out onto the water. So again, in his request, we see the power at play. He doesn't say, Jesus, I'm coming out of the water with you. He says, Jesus, command me to come out onto the water with you. He's very specific in his request. He comes to God in humility because he asks God to make a command him to do something. And these are important elements to remember in our prayer life too. So why is it so important to be specific in our prayers? Why is this an element that we need to remember? So when we're feeling stressed and anxious, we know now that we need to go to God first. And when we go to God, we need to make sure that we go to him in a form of worship. We need to worship him. We need to humble ourselves before him. But why is it important then to make our requests so specific? And the first thing is the idea that a specific request is a serious request. If we are specific in our request, we understand the seriousness of it. I'm reminded of a story where there was I don't think this is a true story, but there's a story out there that there are these there's this captain on the sea, and he's sailing out on the ocean, and he sees this light, and he gets on his radio. He tells the source of this light. He says, we request that you change your direction 10 degrees because we're going to crash. And the light comes back and responds to the captain and says, I request that you change your course 10 degrees. And the captain of the ship responds back, I am a captain, change your course 10 degrees. The person at the light responds, I'm a seaman first class, you change your course 10 degrees. The captain says, I'm captaining a battleship, you change your course 10 degrees. And the light comes back and says, I'm a lighthouse, change your course 10 degrees. Obviously, the captain changes his course. So the idea of being specific means that it's urgent and serious. Be specific to understand the urgency and the seriousness of what it is that we're discussing. The next thing is that it provides opportunity for God to work in our lives and for it to be evident to us. If we make a specific request of God, when that prayer is answered, it's going to be really easy to see how God worked in it. I'm reminded of a story of a man who, and this is a true story of a man who was going on, I think it was on an airplane. He's getting onto an airplane, and he quickly said a prayer to God, and he said, God, if it's your will, I'd like to share the gospel with somebody on this airplane. A very specific request. And sure enough, he sits down on the airplane, and a man in a business suit sits down next to him, and the man turns to him, tears in his eyes, and says to him, I'm completely lost. I don't know what to do. I'm in search of answers. Can you help me? Obviously, this man's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe that his prayer was answered so quickly and so specifically like he had asked. But it's interesting to allow God to work in the request that we make specifically so that we can see him working in whatever request that we make. So be specific so that we can be clear about what it is and how it is that God's working. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that making specific prayers often can lighten the load too. We're faced with all sorts of challenges and problems. We've been discussing all sorts of types of anxieties and how to deal with them. When we're feeling anxious, it is really important that we are specific with God about what it is that's making us anxious. Sometimes the problem just seems so big because we haven't broken it down into its various parts to understand it. I know that for many students right now, they're going through a time right now for our grade 12 students where, grad is up in the air. They're not exactly sure what fall is going to look like and what their schooling is going to look like. So take a moment in your life when you are facing some very real challenges about decisions that you need to make, right? Future career aspirations, where you should live, where you should go to school, what kind of job you should get, all of these really difficult choices that you have to make. And now added on to that is this idea that, we don't really know what's next. And I can remember in my own life, if I go back many years to when I had finished high school, and I was thinking about, what kind of career to go into, and it was very daunting. And I felt a lot of anxiety about what it is that I was going to do. But if you go to God and you break it down and you say to God, what specifically you're anxious about, oftentimes that can really lighten the load because we're focused on what it is that God needs to do in our lives, what it is that we're requesting of God in our lives, what it is that we're afraid of. If you identify the fear, oftentimes it's the best way to get over that fear. So those are some reasons it's important that we make our requests specific. One other element of verse 6 was the idea that we need to go to God with thanksgiving. And verse 6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God." So we need to focus, I think, when we're making these requests of God, when we're coming to Him with humility, we need to remember that in all of these things, we're doing it with a thankful heart. It's very often in times when we're feeling anxious and stressed that we focus on the things that we don't have rather than the things that we do have. We focus on the things that we want rather than the things that we've been blessed with. We need to count our blessings. So how especially in moments like this, how do we focus on the good? How do we focus on the things that we've been blessed with rather than the things that we struggle with? And I think an answer can be found in Philippians chapter 4. If we just look a little bit further in that chapter, we see verses 12 to 13, and I'll read those for you. Philippians 4, 12 to 13 says, "I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." So we discussed the trials and anxieties that Paul had gone through, and when we went through that list, and he lists them all. He lists, well, not all. He lists many of the trials and struggles that he went through, and when we read that list, it's quite overwhelming, right? We all deal with various trials, but it's safe to say that Paul really had his share of struggles that he had to go through in the work that he was doing for the gospel. When we look at that list and then we see him talking about how he's learned the secret to be content in every situation, it becomes quite powerful because of the experiences that he's gone through. So what is this secret? How is he content in all of these circumstances? Where does this strength that he draws on to be content? And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but I have these shoes. I think these are like Steph Curry basketball shoes. And on the back, I'm not sure if you can see it, but on the back it says, "I can do all things." And apparently this is taken specifically from the book in Philippians, the passage that we just read. But it's curious that when he writes this on the shoe, "I can do all things," the most important part is missing. What is the secret that Paul was drawing on to find this contentment? And we see at the last part of that passage, "I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." The secret of this strength is Christ and the pursuit of Him. So this idea of being thankful as we make our requests of God means that we need to seek contentment. So we are rejoicing in His sovereignty. We are being reasonable and level-headed as stress and anxiety come to us. And when we make our requests known to God, we are doing it with a heart that is thankful and content in each and every situation, because we are focusing on that which is important. We're focusing on Christ. These other things that come into our lives, there needs to be a recognition of the merit that they hold in the time that we take for them. So it's the single-minded pursuit of what it is that God wants for us. And that's going to give us its share of trials, as we saw Paul talk earlier about those. It's going to give those our fair share of trials. But what about those trials, those anxieties, and the stress that come to us that are in no way associated with our single-minded purpose? And these are the things that God is saying we need to move away from these things and focus on those things that are important. So we need to make sure that we come to God in the midst of the hardships that we're going through, that we learn to be content. And I think that's a really important element too. This isn't going to happen right away. This is a process. The ability to learn to be content. Paul himself says that this was something that he learned through his experiences, and it's something that you and I hope, are learning as well. So this week, when you come to God with the anxieties that you're dealing with, I'm encouraging you to make your requests of God specific, so that you can see Him work, so that you can understand exactly what it is that you fear and what's causing your stress. And that when you do this, that you come to Him with thanksgiving, and you continually push yourself to learn to be content. And we're only going to find that true contentment in Him and the strength that He provides to us. Thanks again for joining me this week. We've got a couple of lessons left, so I look forward to meeting with you over the next couple of weeks. Thanks again. God bless.